The night my son-in-law showed up at my back door, I was pressing seams on a quilt I had been working on since February. That is what I do when I cannot settle. I do not drink. I do not call anyone at midnight. I pull fabric from the basket under my sewing table and I press and pin and stitch until my hands stop trembling and my mind slows to something I can manage. My late husband used to say I had quilted my way through every hard thing that ever happened to us. He was not wrong. He has been gone 9 years, and I am still at it. I heard the knock and thought it was the wind catching the screen door, the way it sometimes does in October when the temperature drops fast. I set down the iron and stood still. There it was again. 3 knocks. Slow and deliberate, like someone who was not sure they had the right to knock at all. I opened the door and my son-in-law was standing on the step. His name is Thomas. He is 32 years old. He teaches 8th grade science at the middle school 2 towns over, and he has the kind of patient, steady face that I imagine his students find reassuring when they are confused about something. That face was not steady that night. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. There was dried blood on his collar. He was holding his right arm against his body at a careful angle that told me, from my years of nursing before I retired, that something in that shoulder was badly wrong. He looked at me and said quietly, I didn't know where else to go. I stepped back and let him in. I did not reach for my phone right away because the moment I moved toward the counter, he shook his head and said, Please, not yet. I need to tell you something first. So I did what I have learned, and 64 years of living is sometimes the most useful thing a person can do. I sat down and I listened. Thomas had been married to my daughter Vivian for 3 years. They lived 40 minutes from me in a duplex near the school where he taught. Vivian worked as a pharmacist at the regional hospital, the same hospital where I had put in 31 years before my knees, and my patients for 12-hour shifts finally gave out at the same time. They had been trying to have a baby for almost 2 years, quietly, the way Vivian does everything, without announcing it or making a drama of it, just steadily and hopefully. 6 weeks before that October night, they had found out it had worked. Vivian was 10 weeks along. They had not told anyone yet. They were waiting for the 12-week appointment, wanting to be sure, wanting to hold it close a little longer. The previous evening, Vivian had been working a late shift. Thomas had been home alone grading papers when his brother-in-law arrived at the door. My son. His name is Patrick. He is 43 years old, my eldest, and I will say what I have spent a long time trying not to say, which is that he has never been an easy person. Not as a child, not as a young man, and not in the 11 years since his sister brought Thomas home and Patrick decided, without explanation and without much effort to hide it, that he had a problem with him. I never fully understood it. Thomas is quiet and kind and works hard and loves my daughter with a steadiness that I have been grateful for every single day. Patrick's dislike had no logic that I could find. It was just there, solid and immovable, the way some people carry a grievance without being able to name where they picked it up. Thomas told me that Patrick had come to the door with 2 beers and an easy smile and said he wanted to talk, man to man, clear the air. He said he had been doing some thinking and he knew things had been tense and he wanted to do better. Thomas, because he is the kind of person he is, invited him in. They sat at the kitchen table. Patrick opened one of the beers and pushed the other toward Thomas, who took it. They talked. Patrick asked about school, about the neighborhood, about whether Thomas had thought any more about buying instead of renting. It felt, Thomas told me, like a conversation they should have been having for years. He said he felt something unknot in his chest that he had not realized was tied. Then Patrick set down the beer and his voice changed. He said, I need you to understand something. You are never going to be enough for her. You know that, right? A teacher's salary, a rented duplex, no real prospects. My sister deserves better and she knows it. She just hasn't figured out how to tell you yet. Thomas said he did not respond right away. He was trying to absorb it. Patrick leaned forward and said, She called me last month, you know. She said she had been thinking about what her life was supposed to look like. She said you were not it. Thomas told me. He stood up. He asked Patrick to leave. What happened after that? Thomas described slowly, his good hand pressed flat on my kitchen table, his voice careful and even, like someone reading aloud from a document they were afraid to put their own feeling into. Patrick did not leave. He moved around the table and said something Thomas would not repeat to me verbatim, but that I understood from context to be a comprehensive inventory of his failings as a husband, a man, and a provider. Thomas told him again to get out. Patrick grabbed his arm, the right one, and shoved him hard into the doorframe between the kitchen and the hallway. And when Thomas tried to pull free, Patrick shoved him again, and he went down, one knee on the linoleum, shoulder hitting the cabinet on the way. He lay there for a moment, and Patrick stood over him and said the words that Thomas would repeat to me sitting at my sewing table in the middle of the night. He said, "Whatever you think you're building here, it was never going to last. And whatever she's carrying, if she even is carrying anything, that kid deserves a real father." Thomas went completely still. He had not told Patrick about the pregnancy. Neither had Vivian. They had not told anyone. And yet Patrick had known, or had guessed, or had heard something, and he had used it, casually and deliberately, the way you use a tool you have been saving for the right moment. Patrick left. He pulled the front door shut behind him with a quiet, ordinary click, like a man leaving after a perfectly pleasant visit. Thomas had sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. His phone was across the room. His shoulder hurt in a way that made him think something was seriously wrong with it. He was afraid to call Vivian at work because she was in the middle of a shift, and because he knew that if she found out what had happened, she would call Patrick before she had thought through what she wanted to do, and that it would turn into the kind of open, raw confrontation that could not be taken back. He was afraid to call me because it was late, and because, he told me with a look I will not forget, he was not sure if I would believe him. That was the part that stayed with me. That this man, who had been in my family for 3 years and who I had watched love my daughter with patience and consistency, was sitting on his kitchen floor with a dislocated shoulder and wondering whether his mother-in-law would take his word over her son's. He drove himself to my house. 40 minutes with one functional arm because he trusted me enough, finally, to try. I called an ambulance. He let me. I rode with him to the emergency room, and I sat in a plastic chair in the hallway, and I thought, clearly and without rushing, about what I intended to do. Not what Vivian was going to do when I called her. Not what Patrick was going to say when he found out Thomas had told me. What I was going to do. The doctor who came out 2 hours later told me Thomas had a partially dislocated shoulder, a significant contusion around his eye socket, and a laceration on his forearm that had required 4 stitches. I sat with that for a moment. Then I took out my phone. I did not call Patrick. I called my oldest friend. Her name is Claudette. We have been friends since we were assigned lockers next to each other in 9th grade, and she told me, without any particular warmth, that I had taken hers by mistake, and she would like it back. We have been close every year since. Claudette retired 3 years ago after 28 years as an investigator with the State Insurance Commission, a job that had given her, as she liked to say, an encyclopedic knowledge of how people lie about money and a very low tolerance for nonsense. She lives 12 minutes from me. She was awake when I called. I told her what Thomas had told me. I told her slowly and without editorializing, which she had trained me to do over decades of friendship. Just the sequence of events. Just what was said and done and in what order. When I finished, there was a pause. Claudette said, "Is the boy at the hospital now?" I said yes. She said, "Has Patrick been told that Thomas talked to you?" I said no. She said, "Good. Keep it that way. Do not call Patrick. Do not tell Vivian until she is off shift and somewhere she can sit down. I need to make some calls, and I need you to do one thing for me first." I said, "What?" She said, when the hospital finishes with Thomas, I need you to ask him, quietly and without pressure, whether he took any photos of what that apartment looked like after Patrick left. I had not thought to ask. Thomas had. There were 7 photographs on his phone, taken before he left the apartment, showing the kitchen, the door frame with the gouge where his shoulder had struck it, and his own face in the bathroom mirror. His face looked worse in the photographs than it had looked when he arrived at my door. I sent them to Claudette at 2:14 in the morning. Vivian arrived at the hospital at 4:40, still in her pharmacy scrubs, her badge still clipped to her pocket. She had gotten my message on her break. She walked through those double doors and went straight past me to Thomas's room without a word. And I sat in that hallway and gave them their time and prayed, as I have prayed since she was a small girl, that my daughter had the steadiness I had tried to raise her to have. She came back out after about 20 minutes and sat down next to me. She did not cry. Vivian has never been a crier. She has always done her grieving quietly and internally and come out the other side with a plan. She said, "Tell me exactly what he told you." I told her, all of it, including the part about the baby. She was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "He knew." I said, "I know." She said, "How did he know?" She said, "I did not know yet, but that Claudette was working on it." Vivian looked at me. She and Claudette have known each other since Vivian was 8 years old. She said, "Okay." Just that. "Okay." Because whatever the rest of her was doing in that moment, the part of her that had grown up watching Claudette and me handle hard things together, trusted that between the two of us we would not make this worse. I said, "I need you to do something difficult. I need you to not call Patrick tonight." She said, "I know." She went back in to sit with Thomas, and I went back to my chair and I waited for morning. Claudette called me at 7:45. I was still at the hospital. I had sent Thomas's photographs, and she had, as she later described it, made a night of it. She had called 3 people before midnight. A retired sheriff's deputy she had worked with on a fraud case 12 years ago. A paralegal she trusted who now worked for a firm that handled civil assault cases. And a woman named Sybil, who was the property manager for the building where Vivian and Thomas rented their duplex, and who Claudette had met at church 8 years prior, and who had, it emerged, been meaning to speak to someone about the state of the hallway camera that covered the front entrance of that building. The camera was working. It had been working all evening. It had recorded Patrick arriving at 7:41 with a paper bag from the convenience store 2 blocks over. It had recorded him leaving at 9:17, unhurried, hands in his pockets, pausing on the front step to check his phone. Claudette said, "There's something else." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I talked to Thomas this morning, before I called you. I asked him some questions about the past 3 years, about incidents, about things Patrick said or did." She paused. He was reluctant at first because he did not want to make trouble for Vivian. But when I asked him about specific occasions with specific details, the picture that emerged was not one incident. It was a pattern. She told me what Thomas had described. Patrick had, over the course of 3 years, made comments to Thomas about his salary, his career prospects, and his suitability as a husband on at least 7 separate occasions that Thomas could recall precisely. He had, twice, said things to Vivian directly that Thomas only found out about later. Once suggesting that Thomas had been seen talking to a woman in a parking lot in a way that Patrick had found suspicious. Once implying that Thomas had complained to Patrick about the marriage in a private conversation that had never taken place. Thomas had told Vivian both times that none of it was true. Vivian had believed him. But it had cost them something each time. Those small accusations, those quiet poisonings, the cost had accumulated. Claudette said, "What Patrick did to Thomas's shoulder is a criminal matter. What he did to that marriage over 3 years is a different kind of matter. Both of them are documentable." She said, "Vivian can file a police report for Thomas. That is her choice and his, and I will support whatever they decide. But there is something I want you to know, independent of what they choose. I said, tell me. She said, Patrick works in insurance. He has for 16 years. I know people in that industry, and I asked one of them last night about Patrick's record. Another pause. There are 2 open complaints against him with the state board. Nothing resolved yet. Nothing public. But complaints do not stay quiet indefinitely, especially when someone with the right background decides to ask about them in the right way. I said, Claudette. She said, I am not doing anything yet. I am telling you what exists. Patrick has been operating for a long time under the assumption that things get absorbed. That family means silence. I want him to discover that this time, someone has been paying attention. What Claudette needed from me was to sit with Thomas the following afternoon and explain, gently and without pressure, that he had a choice about whether to file a police report, that the choice was entirely his, that Vivian and I would support him regardless, and that there were options available whether or not he chose to involve the police. Thomas filed the report. He did it with Vivian beside him, and a composure that I think surprised the officer who took the statement, who clearly expected the kind of emotional disorganization that is natural in these situations, and got instead a man who had already decided what he believed and what he wanted, and who stated it clearly and without embellishment. Patrick was contacted by police 8 days later. I was not present. What I was told, through channels, was that he had not expected it. He had spent 8 days apparently assuming that the family would absorb it. The way family absorbs things, the way Thomas had absorbed 7 instances of quiet cruelty across 3 years because he loved Vivian and did not want to be the source of friction. He retained a lawyer. Claudette's contact in civil litigation sent a letter in response that was, by all accounts, specific in a way that Patrick's lawyer had not anticipated. It cited the building camera footage, the photographs from Thomas's phone, the hospital records, and Thomas's documented account of the previous 3 years of conduct. It was not a threatening letter. It was simply a very complete one. I will not describe every detail of the months that followed because parts of it belong to Vivian and Thomas and not to me to share. What I will say is that the process moved slowly and then, at a certain point, very fast. Patrick entered a plea agreement in the criminal matter. He received 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a restraining order that required him to have no contact with Thomas for 18 months. He did not go to jail. There are people who will say that is not enough. I understand that position. I am not entirely free of it myself. What I know is that this was not the end of his accountability. The insurance board complaints that Claudette had mentioned did not stay quiet. Claudette did not file anything herself. What she did was make sure that the people who were already asking questions had access to a full picture. 3 months after Patrick's plea agreement, the state board concluded its investigation and suspended his license for 14 months for improper conduct in the handling of 2 client accounts. He did not go to prison for that either, but he lost his income and his professional standing and the ability for over a year to practice the career he had built across 16 years. I had not known the full scope of what Claudette had set in motion until she told me over coffee one Thursday morning quietly, the way she does everything. I said, "How long did you know about those complaints?" She said, "I had heard things for about a year and a half. I asked around, but I didn't push." I said, "And you waited?" She said, "I waited until there was a reason. You don't spend a thing like that until you have to. And when you have to, you spend all of it." My granddaughter was born on a Wednesday in late June, and she weighed 6 pounds and 15 ounces, and she announced herself with a force entirely disproportionate to her size. Vivian's labor was long and the hospital was cold, and I sat in a chair in the waiting room for 7 hours and thought about all the waiting I had done in my life, at bedsides and in hallways and in the rooms adjacent to other people's hard things. And how each time I had thought I could not sit still any longer, and each time I had been wrong. Thomas came out to get me when it was time. He walked me down the hall to the room where Vivian was holding their daughter, and he stood in the doorway while I went in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this child who had made it through so much uncertainty before she ever took a breath. Vivian was exhausted in the particular way that is also a form of triumph. She put the baby in my arms and I stood up and walked to the window, and the June light came through the glass and I held my granddaughter in it. And I thought about my own mother, who I lost when I was 11, and about Claudette sitting on the phone in the middle of the night making calls, and about Thomas on my back step saying I didn't know where else to go. I thought about what it costs a person to believe that they will be believed. How much courage that takes. How rarely we deserve it. Patrick was not at the hospital. He and Thomas had not spoken in 5 months. He and Vivian had spoken once, briefly, by phone. A conversation that Vivian had initiated and that she told me afterward was not a reconciliation, but a statement. She had told him what she knew and what she expected, and what the conditions were under which any future relationship was possible. Whether those conditions would ever be met was not something she was willing to predict. Her name is June, after the month she arrived in and after no particular person, which is something Vivian decided deliberately. She said she did not want her daughter to carry the weight of someone else's history before she had made any of her own. I go to their house on Sundays. I bring something from the kitchen every time, a pot of soup, a pan of cornbread, once a blueberry cobbler that Thomas ate most of before Vivian could intervene. June is 3 months old now, and she has Vivian's eyes and Thomas's patience, and she watches everything around her with an attentiveness that I find both familiar and deeply reassuring. I used to believe, for most of my adult life, that keeping the peace was its own form of love, that smoothing things over and choosing silence, and telling yourself that time would take care of what you were too tired to confront, was the compassionate choice. I held that belief for a long time because it was easier than the alternative, and because the alternative required you to accept that some things do not heal on their own, that some silences are not neutral, that what you choose not to say can cause as much damage as what you say. I know better now. When someone comes to your door in the dark, hurting, and chooses to trust you over everyone else available to them, that is not a small thing. That is everything. And what you owe them in return for that trust is not comfort alone. It is action, careful, deliberate, patient action. The kind that does not make noise and does not rush and does not spend what it has until the moment is exactly right. I am 64 years old. I have made many mistakes, and I hope I have learned from most of them. The one thing I want to say clearly, before I let this go, is this. Family is not the people who share your last name. Family is the person who drives 40 minutes in the dark with one arm not working because they trust, somewhere beneath all the fear, that you will open the door. Family is the woman who has been your friend since 9th grade and who picks up the phone at midnight without needing you to explain why you are calling. Family is the daughter who sits still in a hospital waiting room for 7 hours and comes out the other side clear-eyed and decided. The rest of it is just paperwork. I finished the quilt in December. It has been on the foot of June's crib since she came home. It is not my best work. The seams from October are a little uneven, pressed with hands that were not entirely steady, but it is made with the kind of attention you give something when the making of it is the only thing keeping you from falling apart. I think that is what it is supposed to look like when someone loves you through something hard. I think that is exactly right. I think about Thomas on my back step a lot. Not the bruises, those faded. I think about the specific courage it took for him to knock on my door at all. He had driven 40 minutes in the dark with a shoulder that was not working, and somewhere in all of that fear and pain, he had made a calculation. He had decided that I was worth the risk of being wrong about, that I would open the door and not make things worse. That kind of trust is not given freely. It is earned, slowly, by the way you show up over years of ordinary moments, by whether you listen more than you speak, by whether the people around you know, without being told, that when it matters, you will be steady. Thomas knocked on my door because I had, without knowing I was doing it, spent 3 years being the kind of person worth knocking on the door of. That is the first thing I have taken from all of this, that the way we treat people in the small, unremarkable moments is not separate from who we are in the crisis. It is exactly who we are. And Patrick. I have thought about him too. Maybe more than I expected to. What strikes me is not the violence, though the violence was real and it had consequences. What strikes me is the patience of his cruelty. 7 separate incidents across 3 years, each one calculated to erode something. Thomas's confidence, Vivian's trust, the foundation of a marriage that threatened to make Patrick irrelevant. That kind of sustained, deliberate harm does not come from anger. It comes from a place and a person that has never learned to distinguish between what belongs to them and what belongs to other people. Patrick believed he had the right to decide what Vivian's life looked like. He had believed it for so long that it had become invisible to him, the way wrong things do when no one names them out loud. What Claudette did was name it. Not with noise. With documentation. With patience that matched his own, spread over 18 months of quiet attention, waiting for the moment when what she knew could be used. She did not act from anger either. She acted from a clear-eyed understanding that accountability is not an event. It is a process, and the process requires someone willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of making sure the truth is organized before it is deployed. I have thought about what it means to be that kind of person, to have the integrity to collect the truth without distorting it, the clarity to know when to act and when to wait, and the strength to stay steady across the months when nothing visible is happening and you simply have to trust that the work matters. Claudette has those things. She has had them for as long as I have known her. I do not think she was born with them. I think she built them. The way you build anything worth having, through practice and failure and the decision, made again and again to do the harder right thing instead of the easier wrong one. My granddaughter June is 3 months old. She does not know any of this yet. She will not know it for years, and when she is old enough to understand it, I hope the telling of it sounds like history, distant and resolved. I hope what she inherits from this is not the wound, but the response to it, the steadiness, the patience, the willingness to open the door in the middle of the night for someone who needs it. That is what I want to leave her. Not safety from hard things. No one can give that. Just the knowledge that when hard things come, there are people who will stay.